The moment we breached the perimeter of Tarsis Ultra's orbit, the sensors went haywire. Not a flicker, not a stutter, but a deliberate, systemic impossibility. Corridors that should have been linear appeared to fold in on themselves, and readings suggested gravity vectors, oscillating at frequencies impossible for any known material. I am Lieutenant Captain Ardent, Imperial Navy, and this report is my account of the boarding of the Hulk Urbis's whale, lost decades prior, under circumstances never fully recorded, or perhaps erased. The warpstorm surrounding the ship was unlike any I had encountered. Its turbulence did not just buffet the hull, it seemed to pulse in rhythm with the ship itself, as though the vessel had been absorbed into the storm's psychic lattice. My crew whispered of hearing voices, echoes of men and women long dead, but our comms registers confirmed nothing at all, yet the sound persisted. The docking clamps engaged with a grating hum, and the shuttle bay's doors parted to reveal darkness, thickened with suspended particulate matter, illuminated only by our flickering floodlights. As we stepped onto the deck, I recorded anomalies. The floor panels felt colder than the circulating hull air. Condensation gathered along the walls, in strange angular patterns, almost like sigils, yet no such glyphs were listed in the Mechanicus archives for this class of vessel. The first few meters of corridor passed in silence, punctuated by the occasional mechanical thrum of systems attempting to reconcile impossible spatial distortions. My Sergeant Core trailed close behind, scanning with his servo laser, eyes darting to corners where shadows appeared to linger longer than physics allowed. We proceeded to the main corridor junction, where our instruments began reporting compartments that were not on the ship's schematics. The mapping console displayed ghost rooms, layered atop each other in impossible geometry. I could feel the tension coiling within my squad, their disciplined steps faltering as visual cues refused to match sensory expectations. Somewhere ahead, faint murmurs began to coalesce, snippets of conversation not belonging to any living voice, calling names of personnel no longer with us. My own name was repeated, almost rhythmically, overlaid with a distorted litany. I documented this clinically, but each note I made felt inadequate. The very air seemed to resist comprehension. The first environmental hazard revealed itself in the form of sudden temperature drops. One section of the corridor registered a fall of 30 degrees Celsius in the span of 3 paces. Breath crystallized mid-air. Sensors reported ice forming on metal conduits where no water had existed. Core swore he saw a figure in the corner of his vision, human in outline, but impossibly thin, limbs elongated, unnaturally, sinews visible beneath pale translucent flesh. I ordered the squad to hold position while I advanced alone. Weapon raised, the figure vanished. The instant I turned my head fully, leaving only a faint whisper resonating in the vestibule. We reached the junction, leading to the command deck. Here the Warpstorm's influence became tangible beyond the standard psychic fatigue expected in a system under storm. Spatial orientation failed. Corridors bent in ways that could not exist, and ceiling lights traced geometric patterns, mid-air flickering in sync with the resonance I had begun to feel in my chest. I recorded every anomaly, attempting to retain a structured, military lens, despite the dread that crept into my awareness. Instruments showed fluctuating gravity vectors, environmental controls registering sections with negative pressure and temperature simultaneously above and below freezing. My crew murmured about seeing themselves reflected in the panels, but with slight differences, grotesque shifts in anatomy that should have been impossible. A sudden sensor spike drew our attention. The holomarp of the ship flickered, overlaying our current position with areas marked in red that did not exist on any prior schematics. Our Vox network registered distorted chatter, overlapping orders, and a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the ship itself rather than any machinery. Micro-cliffhangers emerged in the form of sudden disappearances, a pair of boots seen marching forward without their owner, the echo of footsteps diverging from the squad's formation. I felt the first pangs of existential unease. The ship was aware of our intrusion. The Warpstorm's resonance was no longer outside. It had permeated the Erebus's wail. I activated the comms link to the fleet, but the signal returned only static overlaid with faint chanting in a tongue I did not recognize, yet instinctively understood as Litanic. I instructed the squad to mark each anomaly, each impossible reading, yet the process was increasingly futile. Every step forward felt recursive. Hallways looped unexpectedly. Sensors reported identical anomalies in sections we had just traversed. I began to notice the recurring motifs, the same numerical sequence appearing in holomech coordinates, the repeated flicker of glyph-like patterns on walls, the persistent choral resonance that seemed to count in some unknown cadence. These motifs were no longer background. They were shaping perception, bending cognition, hinting at a hidden function buried deep within the hulk. As we approached the access elevator to the upper command decks, the Warpstorm's effects intensified. The lights dimmed, then brightened, casting harsh shadows that danced unnaturally. A crew member froze mid-step, mouth opening in silent scream, and then vanished, leaving only a single boot behind. I recorded the incident clinically, noting the anomaly's temporal coincidence with the artifact readings from the ship's core. Core insisted we retreat, but I could not abandon the mission. The anomaly demanded understanding, and perhaps though I did not admit it aloud, the cost of ignorance was higher than the cost of confrontation. By the time we secured the first hatch to the command corridors, the Warpstorm had begun to alter the perception of distance and time. One could traverse a corridor in 20 seconds, only to arrive at a section logged as 20 minutes prior. Every measurement contradicted the last. Every observation threatened to undermine the mind's trust in reality. I concluded my initial report with a warning. The Erebus's wail is no mere derelict. Its systems, its geometry, its very substance are compromised. The Warpstorm is not outside. It is inside, folded into the decks and halls, resonating through walls, floors, and consciousness. And as I keyed the final line into the log, I heard it clearly, whispered in the overlapping litany. "Welcome, Ardent. You were expected." The corridors of the Erebus's wail seemed to breathe around us, even as I tried to maintain the rigid cadence of a military report. My senses betrayed me. The temperature continued to fluctuate unpredictably, sometimes freezing the air, other times suffocating with an almost tangible heat. Corey and the others whispered nervously, their disciplined steps faltering as shadows stretched and bent unnaturally along walls that should have been sterile steel. I maintained a mid-close perspective in my observations, noting both the minute glistening condensation forming on metal conduits and the way angles bent and corridors looped impossibly. Yet nothing in my Imperial training prepared me for the auditory anomalies, voices echoing in corridors that did not exist, calling crew members by name, blending the familiar with the incomprehensible. We reached the junction leading toward the bridge, and there I detected the first body horror anomalies. A servitor had been left chained to a support column, its flesh grafted to circuitry in ways that should have been fatal, its synthetic eyes flickering with residual cognizance. The mechanical limb motion seemed purposeful, deliberate, as though the creature were aware of our scrutiny. I recorded these observations clinically, but internally, I recoiled. The warp surge in the storm outside the hull seemed to resonate directly with these abominations, as if feeding off the ship's past misdeeds. My squad remained silent, but tension was taut, vibrating through the metallic floors beneath our boots. Every breath felt contaminated with the scent of ozone and something more organic. Telemetry revealed further anomalies. The environmental control readings contradicted themselves. Humidity and temperature measures oscillated simultaneously beyond any plausible calibration, while the map overlays continued to shift, showing rooms that did not exist, connecting through corridors that could not exist in three-dimensional space. The Warpstorm's influence was now detectable in the instruments, in their fluctuating data streams, pulsing with a rhythm too precise to be random. It was here that I first noticed the recurring motifs in a more disturbing form. Numerical sequences and glyphs, previously subtle, now appearing as if stamped into the physicality of the ship itself, flickering in synchronization with my own heartbeat. As we moved forward, a whispering reached a crescendo, a distorted litany layering over every comms channel, each syllable vibrating with psychic pressure. One squad member, a gunner named Halric, began muttering phrases in the same cadence, though I could not recognize the language. His voice grew in volume and clarity even as the warpstorm outside intensified. It was as if the ship were guiding him towards some inevitable revelation, drawing the crew into the same ritualistic rhythm embedded within the vessel. The line between observer and participant began to dissolve. The environment was no longer merely hostile, it was communicative. A small anomaly manifested physically. A corridor ahead shimmered, bending light in impossible ways, appearing both near and impossibly distant. Corrid raised his servo laser, scanning the space, but the readings offered nothing conclusive. As I stepped forward, my own reflection appeared on a wall panel, but it was not my reflection. My face was elongated, the eyes sunken, and yet unmistakably mine. I documented the distortion clinically, though internally, I knew this was no mere visual trick. The Warpstorm, or whatever entity had latched onto the Hulk, was beginning to rewrite reality itself, encoding my perception, my identity, into its matrix. The comms console crackled, and for a brief moment a voice filtered through, a partial recording of a previous boarding party. It was distorted, layered over static, recounting the same corridor we had just traversed, but ending in a scream that did not match any known human vocalization. Core shivered visibly, and one of the servitors emitted a low, mechanical groan, responding to stimuli no human could perceive. Environmental factors escalated. Ceiling panels shivered, and the metallic floors radiated vibrations that seemed to trace geometric patterns, pulsing with a cadence synchronized to the choral resonance that haunted us since arrival.
We encountered the first tangible anomaly affecting personnel directly. Haldrick, still murmuring the ritual phrases, lifted his arm, and without apparent force, the wall nearest to him bulged, folding like sinew around the edge of the corridor. I ordered him back, but he did not respond, his voice merging with the entity within the ship. The rest of the squad held position, weapons raised, though no projectile would reach him. Physics itself seemed to bend to the will of the Warpstorm and the ship's anomalous presence. I could feel my own mind resist understanding, cataloging each impossibility while the dread deepened. The corridor warped around him, creating a loop that should not have existed, and Haldrick's form was momentarily duplicated, occupying two spaces at once.
We pressed onward, forced by mission protocol and the incomprehensible necessity to understand what had become of the Erebus's whale. The Warpstorm's psychic resonance increased, hammering at the walls, floors, and minds of the crew. I noticed the recurring motifs again. The glyphs' angles subtly shifted in a sequence, as if tracking something within us. Footsteps echoed in contradictory directions. Whispers responded before the squad could speak, and shadows flickered against every light source in ways unaccountable by any known principle. Every micro-anomaly fed into the next, forming a chain of escalating terror that refused temporal or spatial containment. As we approached the lower bridge access, another micro-cliffhanger presented itself. A comm spike registered a partial voice recording, the warning of a previous captain, truncated, repeating, "They do not wish to leave, and neither will you." The words reverberated through the holomap console, overlaying current data, creating impossible spatial readouts that implied sections of the ship were already occupied by entities we could not see. I documented this meticulously, noting both the mechanical readings and my subjective dread. My training dictated observation, but the Warpstorm had begun to dissolve all certainty. Finally, the squad halted at the elevator shaft leading to the upper command corridors. The shaft itself shimmered, the metal pulsing like sinew, almost breathing. Chorus scanned frantically, while I keyed the log. Erebus's whale is not a vessel. It is a vessel, and a predator, encoded with the remnants of all previous crews and attuned to warp resonance. The choral motifs and numerical sequences observed since boarding are no longer passive. They are functional, predictive, and perhaps malevolent. The chapter closes here, with the crew poised at the threshold of full revelation, hearts and instruments alike resonating with a warpstorm that has already begun to rewrite reality. And as the final line of the log is entered, the distortion in the holomech shifts once more, presenting a new area labeled with my name, as though the Erebus whale anticipates my next step before I even take it. The data core was discovered behind a sealed panel in a section of the ship that, according to all records, should not have existed. Its casing was corroded, overlaid with arcane glyphs that pulsed faintly in rhythm with the warpstorm outside. I recorded the finding immediately, noting the anomaly's environmental context: a sudden drop in temperature, accompanied by a vibration through the floor that aligned with the ship's resonant frequency. Carr approached, scanning for signs of warp contamination. But even his servo laser readings were erratic, flickering between values that alternately indicated extreme heat and freezing cold. The voices we had been hearing since arrival had become more insistent, overlapping, a chorus of prior crews, last words echoing through the corridor walls. I keyed the entry. The anomaly seems conscious, aware of our intrusion, and perhaps capable of altering both perception and reality. Accessing the core required a combination of Mechanicus override and Imperial security protocols. As I initiated the decryption, the surrounding area shifted subtly. Panels appeared to elongate, and shadows bent unnaturally along the walls. Halric whispered again, repeating the distorted litany, now in perfect synchrony with the pulsing glyphs. My attempt to maintain disciplined observation was challenged by the sensory layering, the faint metallic tang of blood, the acrid scent of ozone, the almost imperceptible vibration of unseen machinery, all blending into a nauseating awareness of the ship's sentience. I recorded the anomaly clinically, noting each sensory input as precisely as possible, though the words felt inadequate. When the data core finally unlocked, the holomap display projected partial logs of prior boarding teams, fragmented recordings, overlaid with corrupted textual entries, revealed the pattern. Each crew had succumbed to madness within 72 hours, often beginning with hallucinations and ending in assimilation or disappearance. The voice of a former captain echoed faintly through the recording, repeating a warning we could not fully interpret. "The vessel consumes understanding. You are already counted." My report emphasized the impossible convergence of time and space. One log showed an event occurring simultaneously in 2 corridors that no human could traverse in less than 10 minutes. The warp storm outside had now clearly permeated the interior, creating a resonance effect that amplified these temporal and spatial anomalies. I attempted to correlate the readings with our own instrumentation. The environmental controls displayed impossible data. Oxygen levels fluctuated in localized pockets, gravity vectors oscillated erratically, and the ship's artificial intelligence began responding with fragmented syntax, seemingly aware of the data retrieval. I keyed a micro cliffhanger into the log. The AI's last entry suggested awareness of my presence specifically, referring to me by rank and name. The crew's morale frayed visibly. Cora's usual calm became nervous agitation, and Halrich's mutterings grew louder, more precise, as if he were now acting as conduit for some larger consciousness. I noted the first signs of crew perception corruption, seeing reflections that were slightly distorted, hearing footsteps that did not belong to any living entity. Further exploration of the Core's memory revealed details about the Hulk's cargo and purpose. Classified records hinted at the transport of a Chaos relic intended for Inquisition review, a device capable of siphoning psychic energy to create a self-sustaining warp echo. The logs implied previous oversight or erasure by higher authorities. The anomaly's presence was deliberate, though the original intent had been lost to centuries of bureaucratic obfuscation. I documented the juxtaposition of military and religious considerations, noting the liturgical markings over conduits and blood residue on servitor limbs. Sensory layering intensified. The metallic smell thickened, temperatures fluctuated sharply, and auditory hallucinations merged with mechanical noise, producing an almost symphonic dissonance. Micro cliffhangers appeared in rapid succession. A crew member's reflection spoke when he did not. A holomap panel displayed our current positions with added corridors, some labeled with previous crew names, others entirely blank. Shadows moved independently of any light source, forming shapes that suggested human but not fully human presence. I recorded these anomalies meticulously, alternating between clinical notes and personal acknowledgement of growing dread. The Warpstorm's psychic influence was now palpable in both environment and consciousness. Our instruments reported spikes in warp resonance correlating directly with auditory and visual distortions. The data core revealed another anomaly, an incomplete file, suggesting that the ship itself had been slowly merging with the consciousnesses of its past crews. It described partial assimilation, psychic echoes, encoded into the ship's structural integrity. Time distortion, body horror, and spatial anomalies were symptoms of this process. My report emphasized the correlation. Each previous crew's disappearance coincided with increased Warpstorm resonance, suggesting a causal relationship. The ship had become both predator and prison, feeding on cognition, reshaping reality to preserve the echo of those it consumed. I recorded the first motif recognition, numerical sequences appearing in logs, glyphs, and environmental patterns, repeating in altered form from previous sightings, indicating the ship's latent purpose was unfolding before us. A comm spike interrupted the observation. The channel transmitted static overlaid with a whisper that was unmistakably my own voice, repeating the log entries I had keyed moments before. Cora swore he saw Haldrich simultaneously appear in two places along the corridor. Shadows now moved deliberately, directing attention toward areas of the ship we had not yet explored. I documented this as a micro cliffhanger, noting that the anomalies now affected both perception and physical space. Every measurement contradicted the previous one. Every observation demanded reassessment. The Warpstorm was not merely external. It was encoded into the Hulk, and the ship itself was acting as an agent of the anomaly. By the time we withdrew from the core chamber, the environmental effects had intensified further. The air hummed with low-frequency resonance. The metallic floors radiated an almost flesh-like vibration, and choral motifs previously faint were now unmistakably perceptible in the auditory spectrum. The crew moved cautiously, but even their steps were unreliable. The corridors twisted, doubled, and sometimes folded back upon themselves without warning. Each micro cliffhanger reinforced a larger, macro uncertainty. The Erebus's whale was no longer a vessel. It was an active, thinking environment, reshaping itself and our perceptions with deliberate intent. Finally, as we retreated toward the lower maintenance decks, a final revelation emerged. A log entry addressed me directly, partially corrupted, but clear enough to send dread spiraling through the squad. Ardent, you are already within the design. You cannot leave unaltered. I keyed the observation, aware that the anomaly was now targeting our awareness, reshaping perception, and possibly prefiguring assimilation. The chapter ends here, with the crew poised between investigation and survival, the Warpstorm outside reflecting a reality that no longer obeyed reason, and the data core's revelations promising a deeper, more horrifying understanding of the Hulk's true function. The lower engineering decks were colder than any section we had encountered, though the temperature readings fluctuated wildly, sometimes below freezing, sometimes alarmingly warm, as though the ship itself were breathing. The walls were streaked with corrosion, interlaced with crimson traces that suggested blood yet refused to be identified as human. I recorded these anomalies clinically, noting the juxtaposition of the mechanical and organic. Haleric continued his murmuring, now in rhythm, with a pulsing glyph etched across the conduit panels. The litany was unmistakable, warped fragments of Imperial hymn, incomprehensible and yet eerily precise, echoing in the corridors like a psychic heartbeat. The Warpstorm outside pulsed in tandem, as if reacting to our investigation and amplifying the ship's presence within our minds. We encountered the first evidence of deliberate ritual contamination. Servitors had been arranged along the main conduit in positions that suggested ceremonial placement rather than mechanical necessity. Their limbs were grafted with additional hydraulic components and sinew-like tendons, forming grotesque alignments that traced patterns into the floor tiles. Coronae documented their positions meticulously. Even the angles of the graphs seemed to correspond with the recurring numerical sequences I had observed since boarding. The squad remained silent, unsettled, as if each step further into the deck brought us closer to an invisible liturgical altar. We could not yet comprehend. The ambient hum of machinery combined with the faint choral resonance to create a sensory layering that was increasingly difficult to parse. As we advanced, spatial anomalies escalated. A support beam appeared twice simultaneously, in two different locations along the same corridor. I attempted to recalibrate our holonorp, but the readings contradicted each other, indicating a recursive spatial loop. Gravity fluctuated locally, forcing crew members to brace against sudden vector shifts, while my own boots sometimes failed to meet the floor. As expected, micro cliffhangers appeared in rapid succession, a shadow that flickered independently, doors that opened only to reveal identical halls behind us, and whispers that alternated between individual crew members' names and distorted echoes of the litany Haleric chanted. I keyed each observation clinically, though a sense of fatalistic dread pressed against every word. At one junction, a wall panel pulsed faintly, as if breathing. I stepped closer, and the glyphs along its surface flickered in sequence, synchronized with Haleric's muttering. The crew instinctively recoiled, but I noted that the anomaly's intensity increased the closer we observed it. This was no random distortion. The ship seemed aware of a tension responsive to observation. The recurring motifs, numbers, glyphs, choral resonance, were converging into a functional system, one that appeared to manipulate perception, and perhaps even the physical properties of the vessel itself. I documented the patterns, attempting to discern a logic that could guide our investigation. Yet each new observation contradicted previous measurements. A sudden micro-cliffhanger occurred when Core pointed toward a hatch that had not been on any prior schematics. As we approached, the hatch shimmered and pulsed with a rhythmic vibration matching the Warpstorm's resonance. Opening it revealed a small chamber filled with floating debris, tools, servitor limbs, fragments of previous boarding teams suspended midair, as if gravity had been suspended selectively. The air within was acrid, heavy with metallic scent, and the walls radiated faint psychic energy that made my thoughts sluggish. I recorded every environmental variable, noting that the anomalies seemed to extend beyond physical distortion to affect cognition directly. Within this chamber, we discovered remnants of a ritualistic act, red sigils traced on the floor, overlapping with Mechanicus schematics, suggesting deliberate fusion of religious rite and technical protocol. A micro-cliffhanger manifested as Halric reached for one of the floating tools, and the object abruptly accelerated toward him, then stopped inches from his face, suspended by an invisible force. The crew froze, the combined fear and awe immobilizing us momentarily. I keyed the observation, noting that every environmental hazard appeared to respond to intent, attention, or presence. Our intrusion was altering the anomaly's expression. Further along, the Warpstorm's psychic influence became more invasive. The temperature shifts now caused hallucinations, brief glimpses of crew members appearing partially fused with machinery, sinews grafted to conduits as if they were extensions of the ship itself. I recorded these in precise technical language, but internally, dread escalated. Each hallucination felt both possible and impossible simultaneously. The ship was enforcing its own logic, rewriting the rules of the environment to reflect its warp-encoded consciousness. Sensory layering intensified. The hum of machinery was now punctuated by low-frequency vibrations, felt directly in the chest, interspersed with choral motifs, echoing in unpredictable cadences. At a T-junction, I noticed the numerical motif repeating on the floor panels in glowing red sequences. Walking over them caused a faint harmonic in the hull, as though the numbers were embedded into the physical lattice of the ship, interacting with warp resonance. Another micro-cliffhanger occurred. A reflection of my own face appeared in the polished conduit metal, but the eyes were hollow, staring back with an awareness that transcended the material. I documented the sighting, aware that the anomaly's influence was now personal, targeting consciousness rather than simply environment. The chapter culminates as we approached a larger maintenance shaft, its access hatch slightly ajar. Inside, the pulsing glyphs converged into an almost altar-like structure, wires and conduits intertwined with crimson-streaked panels. The choral resonance reached a temporary crescendo, synchronized with the Warpstorm beyond, and Halric froze mid-step, muttering the litany with perfect cadence. The crew held position, unsure if the anomaly was passive or aware of our intentions. I recorded the final observation. The lower decks are no longer merely spatial anomalies. They are ritualized, warp-touched, and sentient in ways that defy comprehension. The hatch before us promised further revelation, a convergence of warp influence, ritualistic contamination, and environmental horror that demanded our next step, though each advancement carried a cost to perception, sanity, and perhaps even corporeal integrity. The maintenance shaft opened into a cavernous chamber, unlike anything documented in the ship's blueprints. Its walls were sheathed in interlaced conduits, some active, some dead, overlaid with glyphs pulsing faintly in rhythmic patterns that matched the Warpstorm's resonance. The air was thick with metallic scent and a tang of ozone, interspersed with faint, indefinable, organic odors. I recorded the environmental variables meticulously, noting that each measurement seemed to defy physical consistency. Humidity levels fluctuated rapidly, temperatures swung between extremes, and gravity appeared selective, affecting individuals differently across the floor's expanse. The Warpstorm outside had now fully permeated the Erebus's wail, manifesting inside as both sensory and cognitive distortion. As we advanced, Halrich's chanting intensified, now perfectly synchronized with the pulsing glyphs on the walls. The litany seemed to merge with the Warpstorm itself, producing harmonic vibrations that resonated through metal and flesh alike. I noted the emerging pattern. The anomalies were no longer passive. They interacted with intent, responding to observation, presence, and psychological state. The first major micro-cliffhanger occurred when a conduit snapped violently, releasing a burst of energy that warped the air, temporarily freezing a section of floor, while simultaneously causing panels to flex unnaturally. Cor narrowly caught a falling servitor limb. The rest of the squad froze, aware that the chamber was asserting control over physical reality itself. Body horror escalated quickly. Organic matter, intertwined with machinery, formed grotesque hybrids suspended along the chamber walls. A former servitor had been grafted into the framework of a support column, its limbs fused with hydraulic pistons, sinew visible beneath taut synthetic skin. Haldrich staggered back, whispering the distorted litany, and his reflection in a polished conduit briefly morphed into a composite of previous crew members, ghosts preserved within the anomaly. I documented every feature clinically: the grafts, the hybrid musculature, the partial preservation of cognitive function, evidenced by residual servitor responses. The Warpstorm seemed to feed off these amalgamations, amplifying both environmental instability and psychic resonance. We approached a raised platform at the chamber's center, where a pulsating artifact rested on a pedestal. Its surface shimmered as though liquid etched with the same glyphs recurring throughout the ship. The hollow map indicated this was not in any recorded schematics. I keyed the observation. The artifact radiates warp energy and seems to function as a nexus for the anomalies observed. As I stepped closer, the air thickened. Temperature readings rose and fell unpredictably, and low-frequency vibrations were felt directly in the chest. A sudden micro-cliffhanger manifested as Halrich reached for the artifact, and the glyphs flared violently, momentarily projecting spectral images of prior crews looping in endless torment. Telemetry revealed that the artifact's resonance was affecting our instruments, overlaying false readings with fragments of previous log entries. Gravity vectors were unreliable, floors buckled subtly, and shadows moved with apparent autonomy. I documented these events meticulously, noting that the anomalies now included both perceptual and physical distortions. Environmental and psychic layers were inseparable, and the crew began to exhibit signs of cognitive strain, stuttering speech, involuntary muscle tremors, and fleeting hallucinations of corporeal fusion with the ship. The anomaly was no longer external. It had begun to invade consciousness directly. The artifact emitted a low hum, synchronized with Halrich's litany. Numbers and glyphs on the floor panels pulsed in harmony, forming sequences I had seen repeatedly across the ship. I recorded the pattern. Sequences converged at intervals, creating a grid overlay perceptible only in the combination of light, sound, and psychic vibration. I keyed a micro-cliffhanger, noting the recurrence of the numerical motif. The ship was coding awareness, not just for the environment, but for the crew. Each anomaly was recursive, feeding forward into the next, shaping perception and predestining interaction with the artifact. We explored a side chamber adjacent to the central platform. Here, previous boarding team's remains were partially intact, grafted into the ship's structure. Limbs protruded from panels, heads suspended in hydraulic fluid, faces frozen in silent screams. The Warpstorm's influence now seemed to accelerate the decomposition fusion process. What was once flesh was now fused with metal, with psychic residue lingering. I documented the grotesque tableau clinically, noting patterns, previous crew names etched faintly into surfaces, numerical motifs in the arrangement of remains, glyphs tracing pathways through bodies and conduits. Micro cliffhangers appeared as shadows flickered over walls, showing forms that did not belong to any physical presence, echoing the distorted litany. A macro cliffhanger emerged as I noticed that one of the spectral projections had taken my own form, moving independently within the chamber. It repeated actions I had yet to perform, prefiguring steps we were about to take. The artifact pulsed in tandem, reinforcing the recursive feedback loop. I keyed this in the report. The anomaly is predictive, aware, and capable of modeling crew behavior. Every sensory input, environmental shift, and glyph sequence appears deliberate, feeding towards some larger, incomprehensible function. The Warpstorm has ceased to be merely a hazard. It is now a medium through which the Erebus's whale expresses sentience. We made the decision to proceed to the upper command corridors, guided partially by the artifact's resonance and partially by mission imperatives. The lift shaft ahead shimmered, metallic surfaces folding in and out of expected spatial reality. Gravity fluxed, forcing careful bracing. As we ascended, Halleck's muttering had intensified into full chanting, now overlapping with the low-frequency hum of the artifact, producing harmonic distortion perceptible in both instruments and consciousness. The crew followed cautiously, fully aware that each step was prefigured by the ship itself, each movement monitored, amplified, and interpreted by forces beyond comprehension. The chapter closes. As we reached the top of the shaft, a new section of the ship appeared on the holo map, labeled not by previous schematic designations, but by crew designations, including my own. The artifact's glyphs pulsed in warning. The Warpstorm resonated violently outside, and the distorted litany overlapped with Howrick's chanting, producing a combined psychic resonance that left the squad frozen in anticipation. I keyed the final observation. The anomalies have escalated beyond environment or perception. They are now predictive, sentient, and interactive. The next step promises both revelation and irrevocable cost, with the Warpstorm outside serving as both medium and amplifier. The upper command corridors defied every principle of architecture and reason. The walls pulsed faintly, as if the ship's hull were a living organism. Gravity shifted subtly beneath our feet, forcing recalibration with each step. The air was thick with an acrid metallic tang, interlaced with the residual scent of charred organic matter. I recorded each environmental variable with clinical precision, noting that temperature, humidity, and airflow fluctuated unpredictably. The Warpstorm outside pulsed in synchrony with the anomalies, its psychic resonance now fully infiltrating the vessel. Halleric's chanting merged with the choral motifs embedded within the walls, creating harmonic vibrations that resonated in the chest and skull. I keyed each observation, aware that the anomalies were no longer external hazards, but integrated agents shaping perception. As we proceeded, shadows detached from their sources, moving independently along the walls and ceiling. A panel flickered, projecting a spectral image of a prior boarding team. They mirrored our movements with an uncanny precision, yet their expressions were frozen in grotesque terror. Cora raised his servo laser, scanning for warp signatures, but readings fluctuated violently, as if the instrument itself were caught in a temporal loop. Micro cliffhangers, accumulated footsteps, echoed in impossible directions. Environmental readings contradicted visual cues, and the distorted litany of Halric overlaid previously logged voice fragments from the data core. The anomaly was recursive, predicative, and responsive, interacting with cognition directly. We reached a junction where the corridor split into multiple paths, each bending impossibly, folding in on itself. The holomap flickered, displaying new rooms and hallways not present in prior schematics. Numerical motifs, previously subtle, now appeared etched across floor panels, pulsing with rhythmic precision. I recorded that these sequences seemed designed to guide, or perhaps manipulate, the crew's movement. Every metric, from structural integrity to air composition, reinforced the sense of predestination. Each step felt absurd, anticipated, and recorded. A micro cliffhanger emerged as a crew member briefly appeared duplicated in a reflection, both images performing slightly different movements, an uncanny divergence from reality that unnerved the entire squad. Environmental hazards intensified. Temperature gradients caused localized frost to appear and vanish in seconds. Panels shivered as if breathing. Low-frequency vibrations shook the floor, producing resonance in the chest and skull. Hallett's muttering intensified, harmonizing with the Warpstorm and the ambient choral resonance. Body horror presented itself. A servitor, partially fused with a wall, attempted to move its mechanical limbs, sinews stretching beyond anatomical plausibility. I recorded these observations clinically, noting that the anomaly now integrated both body and environment, and that psychic resonance seemed to animate structural elements as though they were extensions of the anomaly's consciousness. A calm spike interrupted observation, transmitting fragmented audio from an unknown source. The voice repeated my own prior log entries, warped and distorted, then dissolved into the overlapping chant of Halric. I keyed the anomaly. The ship now models crew cognition, overlaying past, present, and predicted future behavior into environmental feedback. Another micro cliffhanger emerged when a panel near the junction opened spontaneously, revealing a darkened alcove filled with floating debris, tools, fragments of prior crews, and mechanical components suspended in defiance of gravity. The air shimmered with low-frequency vibration, affecting perception and causing dizziness. We advanced toward the bridge, guided partially by the artifact's resonance, partially by mission imperative. A side chamber revealed the grotesque fusion of flesh and machine. In previous crews, limbs fused with conduits, heads partially preserved in hydraulic fluid, expressions of terror frozen permanently. I recorded the environmental, bodily, and psychic variables meticulously. The anomaly's influence extended through time and space, encoding trauma and perception into the ship itself. The numerical and glyph motifs aligned along the walls and floor panels, forming sequences that appeared predictive of movement and behavior. Another micro cliffhanger presented itself, shadows detached from walls, moving in synchrony with spectral images of prior crews, mirroring our exact formation, yet reacting independently to attention. A sudden macro cliffhanger emerged as I realized the artifact's resonance was amplifying the predictive nature of the anomalies. Halric, still chanting, began to move independently, guided by a force encoded within the ship. The crew hesitated, fearful of triggering environmental or psychic consequences. I keyed my observation. The anomaly is now interactive, sentient, predictive, and capable of influencing behavior directly. Every step we take seems prefigured. The ship is no longer merely a hazard, but an active agent shaping perception, cognition, and spatial reality simultaneously. The corridor to the bridge twisted in ways impossible to map. Gravity shifted abruptly. A section of floor angled vertically, forcing a careful ascent. Glyphs pulsed in coordination with Halric's chanting. Numeric motifs converged to form partial geometric sequences across the walls and floor. I recorded that these recurring motifs now function as an integrated system, merging environmental, psychic, and cognitive feedback loops. Footsteps echoed incorrectly. Reflections acted independently. Environmental controls displayed contradictory readings in real time. Each anomaly reinforced the next, creating a chain of escalating horror that defied comprehension. As we reached the outer vestibule of the bridge, the Warpstorm's resonance intensified. Shadows twisted and merged, echoing both spectral forms of previous crews and duplications of our own movements. A low-frequency vibration resonated through metal, flesh, and mind, producing both nausea and heightened awareness. Halric's chanting reached a crescendo, harmonizing with choral motifs embedded within the walls. A final micro-cliffhanger manifested as the artifact in the central platform flickered, projecting spectral light across the corridor, illuminating forms that were not there moments before. I keyed the observation. The anomaly is escalating in both environmental and psychic influence, promising both revelation and irrevocable consequence. The chapter ends with the squad poised at the bridge threshold, suspended between comprehension and terror. The Warpstorm outside acts as medium and amplifier. The anomaly has shifted from passive hazard to active, sentient manipulation, and the next step promises a confrontation with forces beyond human understanding. Every metric, every sensory input, every reflection of self signals that the Erebus's wail is no longer merely a ship, but an interactive, predictive, warp-infused entity. The artifact awaits, and with it, the full escalation of horror. The bridge vestibule was not as expected. Holomaps suggested a functional command center, yet the walls breathed subtly. Flexing with an impossible rhythm, panels glimmered with residual energy from the artifact below, and faint glyphs, previously sporadic, now traced entire corridors in glowing sequences. I recorded the environmental readings clinically. Temperatures oscillated sharply, gravity shifted in localized pockets, and air density fluctuated, producing both nausea and heightened perception. The Warpstorm's psychic resonance outside had begun to encode itself within the hull, sending vibrations directly into the crew's consciousness. Halric's chanting intensified, now perfectly synchronous with the glyphs, producing a harmonic vibration felt simultaneously in metal, flesh, and mind. Shadows behaved autonomously, peeling away from surfaces to trace unpredictable patterns along the walls and ceiling. Spectral echoes of prior boarding parties appeared intermittently, duplicating our movements with unsettling precision. Curry adjusted his servo laser repeatedly, yet readings alternated between extreme values, as if instruments were themselves being rewritten by the anomaly. I documented these micro-cliffhangers meticulously, footsteps echoing in directions physically impossible, reflections moving independently, and glyphs projecting subtle hints of prior crew names. The anomaly was no longer a passive environmental hazard. It now integrated perception and cognition, manipulating awareness as deliberately as it reshaped space. A corridor panel shimmered, as if it were liquid. Approaching it, I noticed the numerical motifs repeating in complex sequences across the floor. Each step we took caused slight shifts in glyph intensity and floor vibration, indicating interactive feedback between movement and anomaly. Halric, compelled by the artifact's resonance, moved in perfect cadence with these environmental signals. A micro-cliffhanger manifested. The spectral projection of a previous officer appeared behind him, mimicking movements that had not yet occurred, creating an eerie temporal dissonance. The anomaly had achieved predictive capacity, interfacing directly with cognition and spatial perception simultaneously. Body horror escalated sharply. A servitor, partially fused with a conduit, twitched involuntarily, sinews stretching beyond plausible anatomy. Flesh grafts had fused with hydraulic pistons, forming grotesque articulations. I documented the modifications clinically. Muscle fibers intertwined with conduit, residual neural responses preserved in partial servitor cognition. The Warpstorm's psychic energy seemed to feed this process, amplifying both environmental distortion and cognitive disorientation. Micro cliffhangers appeared rapidly. Reflections of crew members shifted independently. Shadows merged into semi-corporeal forms, and environmental readings contradicted each other, creating a sense of recursive instability that fed directly into dread. The artifact's influence became more explicit. Spectral glyphs now projected across walls and floor, forming partial geometric sequences. These sequences pulsed in synchrony with Howrick's chanting, and with each pulse, sections of the bridge appeared duplicated, folding reality back upon itself. I keyed observations. The anomaly was now predictive, interactive, and recursive, encoding both environmental and psychic feedback into a system of deliberate manipulation. Crew movement was subtly influenced, cognition strained by impossible reflections, auditory hallucinations, and low-frequency resonance, affecting perception of time and space. As we reached the bridge proper, new macro cliffhangers emerged. The command consoles flickered, overlaying spectral imagery of previous crews performing operations that defied known protocols. A holomap displayed our positions inaccurately, folding corridors into impossible loops, some labeled with prior officer names, others blank. Glyphs projected numerical sequences over panels, pulsing in tandem with the artifact. The anomaly now functioned as both environment and sentience, shaping space, perception, and predictive behavior. Micro cliffhangers persisted. Footsteps echoed independently, shadows acted deliberately, and Howrick's voice merged seamlessly with prior crew recordings, producing harmonic distortion perceptible in both instruments and consciousness. A side corridor revealed previous boarding teams, preserved in partial fusion with structural elements. Limbs protruded from walls, heads suspended in hydraulic fluid, expressions frozen in perpetual terror. I documented environmental, bodily, and psychic variables meticulously. Numerical motifs traced pathways through bodies and conduits, glyphs marking spatial and temporal distortions. The anomaly's recursive behavior indicated intentional encoding of trauma and cognition into ship infrastructure. Micro cliffhangers emerged continuously. Spectral forms moved independently. Shadows distorted perception, and environmental measurements contradicted visual cues, producing compounded uncertainty. We approached the artifact's projection, which now occupied the center of the bridge, like an altar. The pulsing glyphs aligned with Howrick's chanting, and low-frequency vibrations resonated in metal, flesh, and mind. The Warpstorm's psychic energy intensified, integrating with the anomaly to produce environmental, cognitive, and temporal distortions. Macro cliffhanger. Howrick's form began to duplicate, both versions performing slightly different actions, illustrating the predictive and manipulative power of the artifact. I keyed my observation. The anomaly is now fully interactive, sentient, and recursive, shaping environment, perception, and crew behavior with precision. Micro cliffhangers accumulated as we prepared to interface with the artifact. Panels flickered, projecting prior log entries in spectral overlay. Shadows coalesced into humanoid forms, mimicking our movements, yet independent numerical motifs pulsed across floors and walls in sequences that corresponded to our steps, environmental shifts, and cognitive patterns. The anomaly's recursive function now extended to memory encoding, projecting prior crew trauma as hallucinations. I documented the recurrence of motifs. They now functioned as both predictive and manipulative, encoding past, present, and anticipated future states. The chapter closes with the squad poised at the artifact's central projection, suspended between comprehension and dread. The Warpstorm outside serves as medium and amplifier. Predictive, sentient, and interactive anomalies have escalated to full convergence, integrating environmental, cognitive, and bodily distortions. Every sensory input, every reflection, every echo of prior crew indicates that the Erebus's whale has shifted from vessel to conscious entity. The artifact's glyphs pulse in warning. The bridge is warped in impossible geometry, and Halrich's chanting has merged with choral motifs and spectral echoes. The next step promises revelation and irrevocable cost, with the anomaly now anticipating our behavior before we act. The bridge had become a living lattice of sound, shadow, and resonance. Gravity shifted sporadically beneath our feet, sometimes pulling toward walls, sometimes suspending us in slight vertigo. Air density fluctuated in uneven pockets, amplifying the metallic tang with faint traces of ozone and decomposition. I keyed every environmental metric, aware that the Warpstorm outside was now inseparable from the anomalies within the ship. Halrich's chanting resonated with glyphs along the walls, creating harmonic vibrations felt directly in chest, skull, and nervous system. Micro cliffhangers emerged with every step. Shadows peeled from surfaces independently, spectral forms of prior crews moved unpredictably, and reflections of our own faces twisted subtly in impossible angles. The artifact pulsed with increasing intensity. Glyphs projected across the bridge, forming sequences of numbers and geometric patterns that responded to our presence. The recursive anomaly now engaged predictive cognition. Our movements, reactions, and even tentative thoughts were reflected in spectral projections, slightly altered to induce unease. I documented the effect clinically. Environmental distortion, psychic interference, and body horror coalesced into a unified system. A micro cliffhanger occurred when Halrich, compelled by resonance, reached toward a pulsing glyph. It flared violently, projecting spectral images of previous crews screaming silently, suspended between panels and air. Body horror intensified. Servitors, partially fused with conduits, twitched, their sinews extending impossibly, hydraulic pistons flexing like elongated limbs. Remnants of previous boarding teams protruded from walls, heads partially preserved in hydraulic fluid, expressions frozen in terror. The anomaly now integrated flesh, machinery, and psychic residue into environmental feedback. I documented these observations precisely, noting recursive interactions. The anomaly encoded trauma and perception into structural components, projecting past suffering into current reality. Shadows flickered independently. Spatial anomalies contradicted every visual cue, and auditory hallucinations overlapped environmental sound. We advanced toward the artifact, guided by its pulsing resonance. Floor panels warped beneath our feet, bending paths that appeared solid only moments before. Glyphs traced routes across surfaces, forming sequences that responded to our steps, voice intonations, and visual attention. A micro cliffhanger emerged as a spectral projection, duplicated core, performing a slightly altered action, seconds ahead of his actual movement. Predictive interaction was now manifest, integrating cognition, perception, and environmental manipulation. I keyed the anomaly. The ship is not merely sentient, it is actively modeling behavior, using prior, present, and projected future states to shape experience. Telemetry indicated environmental readings that defied instrumentation. Gravity vectors shifted abruptly. Temperatures spiked and dropped in localized pockets, and air density fluctuated unpredictably. Panels pulsed with low-frequency vibration, in resonance with Halrich's chanting. I noted that the artifact amplified these effects, projecting predictive sequences of glyphs, numerical motifs, and harmonic resonance. A micro-cliffhanger occurred when shadows converged, forming partial humanoid silhouettes that mirrored the crew's positions, but moved independently, tracing impossible paths across walls and ceiling. In a side alcove, previous boarding team's remains were fused into ship infrastructure. Limbs extended unnaturally from walls, heads partially submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted with machinery. I documented these features in precise detail, noting that the anomaly's recursive function encoded prior trauma, projecting it as environmental and psychic distortion. Glyphs and numerical sequences traversed these remains, forming partial geometric motifs that responded to our presence. Micro-cliffhangers persisted, reflections moved independently, auditory hallucinations overlapped environmental noise, and shadows acted as autonomous agents influencing perception. A sudden macro-cliffhanger emerged as the artifact's resonance intensified. Halrich's voice multiplied, merging with spectral echoes of previous crews, and the ship's harmonic resonance. The bridge's geometry folded impossibly, corridors doubling back upon themselves. The artifact projected spectral glyphs and numerical sequences across surfaces, responding to our cognition. I recorded the anomaly's predictive function. Every step, glance, and action is mirrored, altered, and used to manipulate perception, environmental variables, and behavior. Reality itself was now subordinate to the anomaly's will. Micro-cliffhangers accelerated as we neared the artifact. Panels flickered, projecting prior log entries in overlay. Reflections duplicated our forms in altered states. Environmental readings contradicted sensory experience. Low-frequency vibration increased, producing nausea and cognitive strain. Shadows coalesced into semi-corporeal forms, interacting with the spectral imagery of prior crews. The artifact's harmonic pulses synchronized with these events, creating recursive feedback loops that amplified both dread and psychic instability. I noted the anomaly now functions as predictive, interactive, recursive system integrating body, mind, and environment simultaneously. The final approach to the artifact revealed its centrality. Pulsing glyphs aligned with harmonic resonance, numeric motifs formed interlaced geometric sequences across the bridge. Environmental, cognitive, and body horror signals peaked. Gravity shifted unpredictably. Reflections moved independently, and spectral echoes of prior crews repeated motions slightly ahead of reality. A macro cliffhanger emerged as Halrich's forms split into two, each acting semi-autonomously, guided by artifact resonance and Warpstorm amplification. I keyed the observation. Predictive, sentient, interactive anomalies have reached full convergence, integrating environment, cognition, and previous trauma into a unified system. The chapter closes with the squad poised at the threshold of the artifact's projection, suspended between comprehension and terror. The Warpstorm outside serves as both medium and amplifier. The anomaly has evolved beyond environment and perception, and recursive, sentient manipulation has become unavoidable. Every sensory input, reflection and echo of prior crew indicates the Erebus's whale has fully transformed into a conscious, predictive, interactive entity. The artifact's glyphs pulse with warning. The bridge folds in impossible geometry, and Harrick's chanting merges with spectral echoes. The next step promises both revelation and irrevocable cost, with full escalation of psychic, environmental, and corporeal horror imminent. The artifact's pulse dominated the bridge, filling every sensory channel with a resonance that blurred thought and environment. Gravity shifted without warning. Sections of floor lifted vertically, forcing careful bracing. The air thickened, carrying metallic, ozone-tinged scents, with faint hints of charred organic matter. I recorded each variable temperature, air density, and fluctuating gravity readings, all defying prior laws of physics. Halrick's chanting became layered, overlapping with spectral echoes of prior boarding teams, creating harmonic distortion that penetrated both instruments and consciousness. Shadows now moved autonomously, forming humanoid silhouettes that mirrored and diverged from crew positions. Micro cliffhangers occurred in rapid succession. Spectral forms appeared and vanished. Reflections acted independently, and glyphs projected predictive sequences that aligned with crew movements. We approached the artifact cautiously. Its surface shimmered like liquid metal, etched with glowing glyphs that pulsed in response to our presence. Numerical motifs on floors and walls formed complex sequences, encoding predictive behavior. I noted that the anomaly now integrated cognition, environmental variables, and spatial perception, effectively modeling crew movement and mental state. A micro cliffhanger presented itself as Cora briefly vanished from sight, only to appear floating a meter above the deck, limbs suspended unnaturally in alignment with gravity fluxes. The artifact responded subtly, pulses accelerating in direct correlation with his movement. Body horror escalated further. Servitors partially fused with walls twitched, sinews stretching beyond anatomical plausibility. Limbs of prior boarding teams protruded from walls and conduits, heads partially submerged in hydraulic fluid, expressions frozen in silent terror. I documented these features clinically, noting the anomaly encoded trauma, perception, and psychic imprint into the ship's structure. Halleric's chanting appeared to accelerate grafting of subtle psychic imprints into environmental features, reinforcing recursive predictive sequences. Micro cliffhangers emerged as spectral reflections of crew members acted independently, repeating actions slightly ahead of reality, hinting at manipulation of both perception and potential future events. The artifact's glyphs projected geometric sequences across the bridge, each pulse synchronized with Halrick's chanting and the Warpstorm outside. I keyed observation. The recursive anomaly now functioned as a predictive system, mapping both environment and cognition into interlinked feedback loops. Shadows converged with spectral echoes of prior crews, forming dynamic patterns that anticipated our movements. The predictive manipulation was undeniable. The anomaly now guided crew behavior, altering perception and shaping both physical and psychic environments simultaneously. Micro cliffhangers persisted, reflections shifted independently, panels flickered with impossible readings, and low-frequency vibrations produced disorientation and nausea. A macro cliffhanger emerged when Halrick's form duplicated in multiple projections, each acting semi-autonomously, guided by the artifact's resonance and Warpstorm amplification. The bridge's geometry folded in impossible configurations, corridors doubled back upon themselves, and the artifact projected spectral sequences, indicating prior crew positions, now occupied by ghostly duplicates. I keyed observation. The anomaly had transcended environmental manipulation, and now integrated predictive cognition, recursive interaction, and behavioral guidance into a unified system. Every crew movement appeared prefigured, every perception anticipated. A side corridor revealed previous boarding teams, fused with structural components, limbs protruding into conduits, heads partially submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted with machinery. Glyphs traced sequences through these remains, encoding spatial and cognitive patterns, reinforcing the predictive system. Micro cliffhangers continued. Spectral forms moved independently. Auditory hallucinations overlaid environmental noise, and shadows acted as autonomous agents influencing perception. The anomaly's recursive behavior now encoded prior trauma and projected it into current reality, ensuring that fear, disorientation, and dread were amplified continuously. We advanced toward the artifact, guided by resonance and mission imperative. Floor panels warped underfoot, bending in impossible geometries, while glyphs traced routes responding dynamically to our presence. Predictive sequences duplicated spectral forms of prior crews, displaying actions slightly ahead of reality. I keyed observations clinically. The anomaly now functioned as an interactive, sentient system, integrating environmental, psychic, and behavioral manipulation with recursive encoding of trauma and cognition. Halric moved in synchrony with glyphs, his chanting amplifying harmonic resonance and predictive anomaly activity. Micro cliffhangers accelerated, panels flickered, reflections duplicated independently. Low-frequency vibration intensified, producing nausea, vertigo, and cognitive disorientation. Shadows merged into humanoid forms, interacting with spectral echoes of prior crews. Environmental readings contradicted visual perception, reinforcing recursive uncertainty. The artifact's geometric and numerical motifs now formed sequences directly linked to crew cognition, behavior, and perception. Predictive manipulation was pervasive. The anomaly anticipated our actions before execution, feeding recursive sensory and psychic distortion back into the environment. The midpoint reveal emerged as I realized the full scope. The anomaly was a fusion of artifact resonance, Warpstorm influence, and recursive predictive function. It encoded prior trauma, integrated cognition, manipulated perception, and distorted physical reality simultaneously. The Warpstorm had become an amplifier, the artifact a conduit, and the ship itself a sentient, interactive predictive entity. I keyed macro cliffhanger observation. The anomaly now controlled the environment, the crew's perception, and recursive projections, effectively forcing us into a confrontation with both conscious and psychic manipulation. The chapter closes with a squad poised before the artifact, suspended between revelation and dread. The Warpstorm outside serves as both medium and amplifier. Predictive, sentient, interactive anomalies have reached full convergence, integrating environmental, psychic, and bodily distortion. Every sensory input, reflection, and echo indicates the Erebus's whale has become a conscious, warp-infused interactive entity. The artifact pulses in warning. The bridge geometry folds impossibly, and Halric's chanting merges with spectral echoes. The next step promises both revelation and irrevocable cost, escalating the narrative toward confrontation and moral decision. The bridge had become unrecognizable, folded and twisted in impossible geometries. Panels glowed with fluctuating glyphs, projecting sequences that pulsed in time with Halric's chanting, and the Warpstorm outside. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably, pulling us toward walls, ceilings, and floor panels at random intervals. Air density shifted in packets, producing nausea, dizziness, and an acrid metallic tang. mixed with faint ozone. I keyed environmental readings meticulously, noting that the anomaly was no longer passive. It actively manipulated cognition, perception, and space simultaneously. Shadows moved independently. Spectral echoes of prior crews duplicated our actions, and reflections twisted in impossible ways. Micro cliffhangers appeared continuously, creating relentless tension. Doors opened into voids, lights flickered, and panels displayed impossible readings that contradicted our instruments. We advanced toward the central artifact projection. The liquid metal surface shimmered with an almost conscious awareness. Glyphs etched in perfect synchronization with harmonic resonance. Numerical motifs across walls and floors, aligned with crew movement, predictive and recursive, encoding cognition into physical reality. Kora paused, momentarily suspended in midair, as gravity shifted abruptly. A micro cliffhanger occurred when a spectral form of him appeared beside him, performing an action he had yet to execute. The anomaly now anticipated behavior, using predictive patterns to manipulate perception and environmental variables simultaneously. The body horror escalated further. Servitors fused with structural conduits twitched unnaturally, hydraulic pistons flexing like grotesque limbs. Limbs and torsos of prior boarding teams protruded from walls, partially preserved in hydraulic fluid. Sinews intertwined with machinery, forming articulated, unnatural structures. Holoric's chanting seemed to accelerate the anomaly's manipulation of flesh and metal, projecting both past trauma and psychic feedback into environmental structures. Micro cliffhangers emerged as spectral echoes of crew members, acted independently, repeating actions slightly ahead of reality, reinforcing dread and cognitive disorientation. The artifact pulsed violently. Glyphs formed complex geometric sequences across the bridge, resonating with low-frequency vibration. I keyed observation. The anomaly had evolved into a predictive, interactive, recursive system, encoding cognition, behavior, and trauma into environmental feedback loops. Shadows converged with spectral forms of prior crews, moving in deliberate patterns that anticipated our every motion. Predictive manipulation became undeniable. Every glance, step, and tentative thought produced recursive changes in the environment, amplifying both physical hazard and psychic strain. A macro cliffhanger emerged as Halrich's form duplicated multiple times, each projection semi-autonomous, yet guided by artifact resonance. The bridge geometry folded upon itself. Corridors twisted, forming impossible loops. Glyphs pulsed in sequences corresponding to crew cognition and movement. I keyed the anomaly now controlled space, perception, and predictive behavior simultaneously. It was no longer merely environmental or psychic. It had become a fully interactive, sentient, recursive system, forcing the crew into a confrontation with forces beyond comprehension. We moved through a side alcove, where previous boarding teams were partially fused with infrastructure, limbs extended unnaturally from walls, heads submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted with machinery. Glyphs trace sequences through these remains, encoding spatial, behavioral, and cognitive data. Micro cliffhangers persisted. Spectral forms moved independently. Low-frequency vibrations distorted perception. Shadows acted autonomously. Environmental readings contradicted visual input. The anomaly integrated both physical and psychic disturbance into a unified system. I documented each occurrence clinically, noting recursive predictive feedback loops shaping both environment and crew behavior. As we approached the artifact, floor panels warped, bending in impossible configurations. Glyphs traced routes, responding dynamically to steps. Voice intonation and gaze, spectral forms duplicated, prior crew members, performing actions slightly ahead of real time. I keyed observations. The anomaly functioned as an interactive, predictive, sentient system, encoding cognition, trauma, and spatial data simultaneously. Haldrick moved in perfect synchrony with the artifact's resonance, his chanting amplifying harmonic feedback across the bridge. Micro cliffhangers accelerated, panels flickered, reflections duplicated independently, and low-frequency vibrations produced both nausea and cognitive strain. A sudden macro cliffhanger arose. As the artifact's pulse intensified, the bridge folded impossibly, corridors looping into themselves. Haldrick's chanting merged with spectral echoes, producing harmonic distortion affecting perception directly. Predictive sequences of glyphs and numbers aligned with our cognition and actions. The anomaly's sentience became undeniable. Every crew movement was anticipated, every perception mirrored and altered, producing both dread and disorientation. A recursive feedback now included body horror, servitors, fused limbs, and spectral echoes interacted dynamically with the anomaly's predictive system. Telemetry confirmed environmental readings, defied instrumentation, gravity, air density, and temperature fluctuated without pattern. Panels displayed impossible sequences, reflecting cognitive manipulation in real time. Shadows converged into humanoid forms, interacting with spectral echoes, further distorting perception. Micro cliffhangers persisted, reflections acted independently, prior crew spectral forms duplicated behavior ahead of reality, and environmental feedback loops intensified recursive terror. I keyed the anomaly's evolution. It was now fully interactive, sentient, predictive, and recursive, integrating space, cognition, and trauma into a unified system. The chapter closes with the squad poised before the artifact, suspended between comprehension and dread. The Warpstorm outside serves as medium and amplifier, escalating environmental, psychic, and body horror. Recursive, predictive, sentient anomalies have converged fully, integrating cognition, perception, and trauma. Haldrick's chanting merges with spectral echoes, bridge geometry folds impossibly, and the artifact pulses in anticipation of our next move. Every sensory input, reflection, and echo of prior crews signals that the Erebus's whale has fully transformed into a conscious, warp-infused, interactive entity. The next step promises both revelation and irrevocable cost, escalating toward crisis. The artifact's pulse had become a heartbeat that synchronized with our own. Gravity shifted erratically, folding sections of the bridge vertically and horizontally. Air density varied in pockets, carrying metallic tangs with acrid traces of decomposition. I keyed every metric: temperature spikes, oxygen density, and fluctuating gravity vectors. Haldrick's chanting had layered with spectral echoes of previous crews, producing harmonic resonance that penetrated instruments and mind alike. Shadows moved independently, reflecting actions that had not yet occurred. Micro cliffhangers emerged relentlessly. Doors opened into voids, reflections twisted impossibly, and panels displayed readings that contradicted physical reality, creating perpetual uncertainty. So we advanced toward the central artifact, its surface now shimmering with liquid metal fluidity. Glyphs etched across floors, walls, and ceilings pulsed in sequences responding dynamically to our movement and vocal intonation. Numerical motifs formed predictive patterns, encoding crew cognition, projecting spectral echoes of prior teams performing actions slightly ahead of our own. Cora was briefly suspended mid-step as gravity shifted, A spectral form of him mirrored the movement, anticipating behavior before execution. I keyed observation clinically. The anomaly now functioned as predictive, interactive, and recursive, integrating environment, cognition, and temporal distortion simultaneously. Body horror escalated sharply. Servitors, fused with conduits, twitched unnaturally. Hydraulic pistons flexing like grotesque limbs. Limbs and torsos of previous boarding teams protruded from walls. Heads partially preserved in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted with machinery. Horrocks chanting seemed to accelerate the anomaly's influence on flesh and structure, projecting prior trauma as ongoing environmental distortion. Micro cliffhangers emerged as spectral forms of crew repeated actions ahead of reality. Shadows moved semi-independently, and reflections twisted to amplify cognitive disorientation. Glyphs formed geometric sequences across the bridge, pulsing in synchrony with harmonic resonance. The artifact projected numerical and symbolic motifs, dynamically encoding predictive feedback loops linked to cognition, perception, and movement. Shadows converged with spectral echoes of prior crews, tracing patterns, anticipating our motions. Predictive manipulation was now undeniable. Every glance, step, and thought produced recursive environmental and psychic distortion. Micro cliffhangers compounded, reflections duplicated independently, auditory hallucinations overlapped real sounds, and panels displayed impossible sequences contradicting reality. A macro cliffhanger emerged as Halric duplicated multiple times, projections acting semi-autonomously under artifact resonance. Bridge geometry folded impossibly. Corridors twisted and doubled back on themselves. Glyphs pulsed with sequences corresponding to cognition, movement, and prior crew positions. I keyed observation. The anomaly had evolved into a sentient, interactive, predictive system, controlling environment, perception, and behavior simultaneously. Every crew action appeared prefigured, every perception anticipated. We moved through side alcoves, where prior boarding teams remained partially fused with structural elements, limbs extended from walls, heads submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted into machinery. Glyphs trace sequences, encoding spatial, cognitive, and behavioral patterns. Micro cliffhangers continued. Spectral forms acted independently. Low-frequency vibrations distorted perception, and shadows manipulated awareness autonomously. Environmental readings contradicted sensory input. The anomaly's recursive function encoded trauma and projected it continuously into reality. Floor panels warped underfoot, bending in impossible arcs. Glyphs traced dynamic routes responding to our steps, voice inflections and gaze. Predictive projections duplicated prior crew actions, slightly ahead of our perception. I keyed observation. The anomaly functioned as a fully interactive, sentient, predictive system, encoding cognition, trauma, and spatial patterns simultaneously. Halric moved in precise synchrony, chanting, amplifying harmonic resonance, further feeding recursive feedback loops. Micro cliffhangers accelerated, panels flickered, reflections duplicated independently, shadows acted autonomously. Low-frequency vibration produced nausea, vertigo, and heightened dread. The macro cliffhanger arose as the artifact's pulse intensified dramatically. The bridge's geometry folded in multiple impossible configurations. Hallic's chanting merged with spectral echoes, producing harmonic distortion directly affecting perception. Predictive sequences of glyphs aligned with our cognition and actions. The anomaly's sentience became fully manifest. It controlled space, perception, and behavior. recursive feedback loops, integrated environmental hazards, body horror, and psychic manipulation. The crew's every motion was anticipated, every sensory input altered. Telemetry confirmed environmental readings were nonsensical. Gravity, temperature, and air density fluctuated in real-time contradictions. Panels displayed impossible sequences, reflecting predictive cognitive manipulation. Shadows merged into semi-corporeal forms, interacting with spectral echoes, further distorting perception. Micro-cliffhangers compounded, reflections acted independently. Prior crew projections repeated actions ahead of reality. Environmental feedback loops amplified recursive dread. I keyed the anomaly's full capacity. Interactive, sentient, predictive, recursive, integrating space, perception, trauma, and cognition. The chapter closes with the squad poised directly before the artifact, suspended between understanding and terror. The Warpstorm outside amplifies environmental, psychic, and body horror signals. Recursive, sentient, predictive anomalies have reached full convergence, integrating cognition, perception, and trauma. Horror's chanting merges seamlessly with spectral echoes. Bridge geometry folds impossibly. The artifact pulses as if aware of our intentions. Every reflection, every spectral echo, every vibration signals that the Erebus's wail has fully transformed into a conscious, warp-infused entity. The next step promises crisis, confrontation with fully manifested hazard, and immediate moral or tactical decisions, escalating tension toward peak horror. The bridge had dissolved into a shifting lattice of impossible geometry. Gravity folded unpredictably. Air pockets thickened and thinned in erratic waves, carrying acrid metallic odors and faint ozone traces. Every panel, every surface, quivered with residual glyph resonance. Haloric's chanting had layered with spectral echoes of previous crews, producing harmonic interference that pierced both instruments and cognition. Shadows moved autonomously, forming humanoid silhouettes that mirrored, diverged, and anticipated crew actions. Micro-cliffhangers emerged relentlessly. Doors opened into voids, reflections twisted beyond comprehension. Panels displayed contradictory readings, and spectral echoes repeated actions, seconds ahead of reality. We advanced toward the artifact, its liquid metal surface, now pulsating with sentient awareness. Glyphs and numerical motifs across floors and walls, synchronized dynamically with our presence. Predictive projections displayed spectral echoes of prior teams performing actions slightly ahead of our own. Cora was briefly suspended mid-step as gravity shifted abruptly. A spectral version of him mirrored the movement, anticipating behavior. I keyed observation clinically. The anomaly had evolved into a fully interactive, predictive, recursive system, integrating cognition, perception, and temporal distortion. Body horror intensified. Servitors fused to conduits twitched violently, hydraulic pistons flexing like grotesque limbs. Limbs and torsos of prior boarding teams protruded from walls, heads submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews intertwined with machinery. Haloric's chanting amplified anomaly activity, projecting psychic trauma into both environment and crew perception. Micro-cliffhangers multiplied. Spectral forms of crew repeated actions ahead of reality. Shadows acted semi-independently. Reflections shifted unpredictably, producing relentless cognitive disorientation. The artifact's glyphs projected geometric sequences across every visible surface, resonating with low-frequency vibration. I keyed observation. Recursive feedback loops now encoded cognition, trauma, and perception into predictive sequences, affecting both environment and crew behavior. Shadows merged with spectral echoes, tracing anticipatory patterns. Predictive manipulation was now undeniable. Every glance, step, and thought reshaped physical and psychic reality. Micro cliffhangers compounded, reflections acted independently, auditory hallucinations overlapped real sounds, panels displayed impossible sequences, creating constant tension. A macro cliffhanger emerged. Halric's form duplicated multiple times, semi-autonomous projections guided by artifact resonance, bridge geometry folded, corridors looping back on themselves, glyphs pulsed in alignment with cognition, movement, and spectral echo projections. I keyed observation. The anomaly was sentient, interactive, and fully predictive, controlling space, perception, and behavior. Every crew action appeared prefigured, every sensory input manipulated. Side alcoves revealed prior boarding teams, fused with ship infrastructure. Limbs protruded from walls, heads submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted to conduits. Glyphs trace sequences, encoding spatial, behavioral, and cognitive data, reinforcing predictive manipulation. Micro cliffhangers persisted. Spectral forms acted independently, shadows moved autonomously, low-frequency vibration produced nausea and vertigo, environmental readings contradicted sensory input. The anomaly now encoded trauma recursively, projecting it continuously into reality, amplifying dread. Floor panels warped beneath our feet, bending in impossible arcs. Glyphs traced dynamic routes responding to steps, voice inflection, and gaze. Spectral projections duplicated prior crew actions, slightly ahead of perception. I keyed observation. The anomaly functioned as fully interactive, sentient, predictive system, encoding cognition, trauma, and spatial patterns simultaneously. Halric moved precisely, in synchrony, chanting amplifying harmonic resonance, reinforcing recursive feedback loops. Micro cliffhangers accelerated, panels flickered, reflections duplicated independently, shadows acted autonomously, low-frequency vibration produced cognitive strain. A sudden macro cliffhanger arose as the artifact pulsed violently. The bridge folded in multiple impossible configurations. Halric's chanting merged with spectral echoes, producing harmonic distortion that penetrated perception directly. Predictive sequences aligned with our cognition and actions. The anomaly's sentience was undeniable. It controlled space, perception, and predictive behavior. Recursive loops now integrated environmental hazards, body horror, and psychic manipulation. Every crew motion was anticipated, every input altered. Telemetry confirmed environmental readings, defied instrumentation, gravity, temperature, and air density fluctuated in direct contradiction to observation. Panels displayed impossible sequences, reflecting predictive cognitive manipulation. Shadows merged into semi-corporeal forms, interacting with spectral echoes, further distorting perception. Micro cliffhangers compounded, reflections acted independently, spectral forms repeated actions ahead of reality. Environmental feedback loops amplified recursive horror. I keyed anomalies' full capacity, interactive, sentient, predictive, recursive, integrating space, perception, trauma, and cognition. The chapter closes with the squad suspended before the artifact, between understanding and terror. The Warpstorm outside amplifies environmental, psychic, and body horror. Recursive, sentient, predictive anomalies have fully converged, integrating cognition, perception, and trauma. Halric's chanting merges with spectral echoes. Bridge geometry folds impossibly. Artifact pulses with awareness. Every reflection, every spectral echo, every vibration signals that the Erebus whale has become a conscious, warp-infused entity. The next step promises full crisis, with irreversible moral and tactical stakes, escalating the narrative toward confrontation and ultimate consequence. The bridge had become a crucible of distortion. Gravity shifted violently. Air pockets oscillated with fluctuating density, and every surface throbbed with pulsing glyphs. Harrick's chanting merged with spectral echoes of previous crews, creating harmonic resonance that assaulted cognition. Shadows moved autonomously, forming humanoid shapes that mirrored and diverged from crew positions. Micro-cliffhangers erupted relentlessly. Doors opened into voids. Reflections twisted independently. Panels displayed readings contradicting all known laws of physics. The Warpstorm outside pulsed in tandem with the artifact, amplifying psychic and environment anomalies. We approached the artifact's central projection cautiously. Its liquid metal surface shimmered like living mercury, pulsing with what I now recognized as conscious awareness. Numerical motifs on walls and floors shifted dynamically, encoding predictive patterns of crew movement, cognition, and perception. Kuro floated briefly. As gravity shifted, a spectral duplicate mirrored him, performing the actions seconds ahead. I keyed observation clinically. The anomaly had reached full interactive, predictive, recursive functionality, integrating cognition, spatial distortion, and temporal manipulation simultaneously. Body horror escalated to acute severity. Servitors fused with conduits twitched violently, hydraulic pistons elongating into grotesque appendages. Limbs and torsos of prior boarding teams protruded from walls, partially submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted into machinery. Howard's chanting amplified harmonic resonance, projecting psychic trauma into both the environment and our perception. Micro-cliffhangers accelerated, spectral echoes of crew repeated actions ahead of reality. Shadows moved semi-autonomously. Reflections shifted unpredictably, producing intense cognitive disorientation. Leafs across the bridge pulsed in interlaced geometric sequences, resonating at frequencies that produced physical and psychic unease. I keyed observation. Recursive feedback loops now encoded cognition, trauma, and perception into predictive sequences, impacting environment and crew behavior simultaneously. Shadows coalesced with spectral echoes, tracing patterns, anticipating our movements. Predictive manipulation was undeniable. Every glance, step, and thought reshaped both physical and psychic reality. Micro-cliffhangers compounded. Reflections acted independently. Auditory hallucinations overlapped real sounds. Panels displayed impossible sequences, creating continuous tension. A macro-cliffhanger emerged as Howrick's form duplicated multiple times. Semi-autonomous projections, guided by artifact resonance. Bridge geometry folded upon itself. Corridors looping impossibly. Glyphs pulsed in sequence corresponding to cognition, movement, and prior crew positions. I keyed observation. The anomaly had achieved sentience, fully interactive, predictive, and recursive, controlling space, perception, and behavior simultaneously. Every crew action was anticipated, every sensory input manipulated. Side alcoves revealed prior boarding teams, fused with structural elements. Limbs protruded from walls, heads submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted to conduits. Glyphs traced sequences, encoding spatial, behavioral, and cognitive data, reinforcing predictive manipulation. Micro-cliffhangers persisted. Spectral forms acted independently. Shadows moved autonomously. Low-frequency vibration produced nausea and vertigo, Environmental readings contradicted sensory input, recursive encoding of trauma, projected continuous dread, making the anomaly omnipresent and unavoidable. Floor panels warped underfoot, bending in impossible arcs, glyphs traced dynamic rotes responding to steps, voice inflection and gaze. Spectral projections duplicated prior crew actions, slightly ahead of perception. Eye-keyed observation. The anomaly functioned as a fully interactive, sentient, predictive system, encoding cognition, trauma, and spatial patterns simultaneously. Harrick moved in precise synchrony, chanting, amplifying harmonic resonance, reinforcing recursive feedback loops. Micro cliffhangers, intensified panels flickered, reflections duplicated independently, shadows acted autonomously, low-frequency vibration induced cognitive strain and vertigo. A macro cliffhanger erupted as the artifact pulsed violently. The bridge folded in multiple impossible configurations. Harrick's chanting merged with spectral echoes, producing harmonic distortion that penetrated consciousness directly. Predictive sequences aligned perfectly with cognition, actions, and environmental variables. The anomaly's sentience was now undeniable. It controlled space, perception, and predictive behavior, recursive feedback, integrated environmental hazards, body horror, and psychic manipulation. Every crew motion was anticipated. Every sensory input altered. Telemetry confirmed. Environmental readings defied all instrumentation. Gravity, temperature, and air density fluctuated in contradictions. Observation panels displayed sequences reflecting predictive cognitive manipulation. Shadows merged into semi-corporeal forms, interacting with spectral echoes, further distorting perception. Micro cliffhangers compounded, reflections acted independently, spectral forms repeated actions ahead of reality, and environmental feedback loops amplified recursive terror. I keyed the anomaly's full capacity: interactive, sentient, predictive, recursive, integrating space, perception, trauma, and cognition. The chapter closes with the squad at the threshold of the artifact's projection, suspended between comprehension and irreversible horror. The Warpstorm outside amplifies environmental, psychic, and body horror. Recursive, sentient, predictive anomalies have converged fully, integrating cognition, perception, and trauma. Halrick's chanting merges with spectral echoes. Bridge geometry folds impossibly. Artifact pulses as if aware of our intentions. Every reflection, every spectral echo, every vibration signals the Erebes' whale has fully transformed into a conscious, warp-infused entity. The next step promises both moral and tactical crisis, escalating toward confrontation with full anomaly manifestation. The bridge had become a corridor of madness. Gravity contorted unpredictably, pressing us against walls or suspending us mid-air. Air pockets thickened and thinned in erratic waves, carrying metallic tangs and faint ozone with whispers of charred flesh. Every panel quivered with residual glyph resonance. Halrick's chanting overlapped spectral echoes of prior crews, producing harmonic distortion that assaulted both instruments and cognition. Shadows moved autonomously, forming humanoid shapes that mirrored and diverged from crew positions. Micro cliffhangers erupted, doors opened into voids, reflections twisted independently, panels displayed readings contradicting every known law of physics. The Warpstorm outside pulsed in tandem with the artifact, amplifying psychic and environmental anomalies. We advanced toward the artifact, whose liquid metal surface now shimmered with conscious awareness. Glyphs and numerical motifs across floors, walls, and ceilings shifted dynamically, encoding predictive patterns of crew movement, cognition, and perception. Spectral echoes of prior teams performed actions slightly ahead of our own. Kurja floated briefly as gravity shifted. A spectral duplicate mirrored him, anticipating behavior. By keyed observation, the anomaly had evolved into a fully interactive, predictive, recursive system, integrating cognition, spatial distortion, and temporal manipulation simultaneously. Body horror reached unbearable intensity. Servitors fused with conduits twitched violently, hydraulic pistons elongating into grotesque appendages. Limbs and torsos of prior boarding teams protruded from walls, heads submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted to machinery. Haloric's chanting amplified harmonic resonance, projecting psychic trauma into both environment and perception. Micro cliffhangers multiplied spectral echoes of crew repeated actions ahead of reality. Shadows moved semi-autonomously. Reflections shifted unpredictably, producing relentless cognitive disorientation. Glyphs pulsed in interlaced geometric sequences, resonating at frequencies producing both physical and psychic unease. Recursive feedback loops now encoded cognition, trauma, and perception into predictive sequences, affecting environment and crew behavior. Simultaneously, shadows coalesced with spectral echoes, tracing patterns anticipating our movements. Predictive manipulation was undeniable. Every glance, step, and thought reshaped physical and psychic reality. Micro cliffhangers compounded. Reflections acted independently. Auditory hallucinations overlaid real sounds. Panels displayed impossible sequences, generating continuous tension. A macro cliffhanger erupted. Halric duplicated multiple times, semi-autonomous projections, guided by artifact resonance. Bridge geometry folded upon itself. Corridors looped impossibly. Glyphs pulsed in sequence corresponding to cognition, movement, and prior crew positions. By keyed observation, the anomaly had achieved full sentience, fully interactive, predictive, and recursive, controlling space, perception, and behavior simultaneously. Every crew action was anticipated, every sensory input manipulated. Side alcoves revealed prior boarding teams, fused with structural elements. Limbs protruded from walls, heads submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted to conduits. Glyphs trace sequences encoding spatial, behavioral, and cognitive data, reinforcing predictive manipulation. Micro cliffhangers persisted. Spectral forms acted independently. Shadows moved autonomously. Low-frequency vibration produced nausea and vertigo. Environmental readings contradicted sensory input. Recursive encoding of trauma projected continuous dread, making the anomaly omnipresent. Floor panels warped underfoot, bending in impossible arcs. Glyphs traced dynamic routes responding to steps, voice inflection, and gaze. Spectral projections duplicated prior crew actions, slightly ahead of perception. By keyed observation, the anomaly functioned as fully interactive, sentient predictive system, encoding cognition, trauma, and spatial patterns simultaneously. Halric moved in perfect synchrony, chanting amplifying harmonic resonance, reinforcing recursive feedback loops. Micro cliffhangers, intensified panels flickered, reflections duplicated independently, shadows acted autonomously. Low-frequency vibration induced cognitive strain and vertigo. A sudden macro cliffhanger arose as the artifact pulsed violently. The bridge folded in multiple impossible configurations. Halric's chanting merged with spectral echoes, producing harmonic distortion penetrating consciousness. Predictive sequences aligned perfectly with cognition, actions, and environmental variables. The anomaly's sentience was undeniable. It controlled space, perception, and predictive behavior. Recursive feedback integrated environmental hazards, body horror, and psychic manipulation. Every crew motion was anticipated, every sensory input altered. Telemetry confirmed environmental readings, defied all instrumentation. Gravity, temperature, and air density fluctuated in contradictions to observation. Panels displayed sequences reflecting predictive cognitive manipulation. Shadows merged into semi-corporeal forms, interacting with spectral echoes, further distorting perception. Micro-cliffhangers compounded reflections, acted independently. Spectral forms repeated actions ahead of reality, and environmental feedback loops amplified recursive terror. I keyed the anomaly's full capacity. Interactive, sentient, predictive, recursive, integrating space, perception, trauma, and cognition. The chapter closes with the squad on the brink of confrontation, suspended between understanding and irreversible horror. The Warpstorm outside amplifies environmental, psychic, and body horror. Recursive, sentient, predictive anomalies have fully converged, integrating cognition, perception, and trauma. Halrick's chanting merges with spectral echoes. Bridge geometry folds impossibly. Artifact pulses with awareness. Every reflection, every spectral echo, every vibration signals that the Erebus whale has become a conscious, warp-infused entity. The next step promises full climax, with moral and tactical stakes escalating toward the final confrontation and irrevocable consequences. The bridge had become an unrecognizable lattice of impossible angles. Gravity shifted violently, alternately pressing us to walls or suspending us mid-air. Air vibrated with thick metallic tangs, ozone, and the faint scent of burning flesh. Halrick's chanting merged seamlessly with spectral echoes of prior crews, producing harmonic resonance that assaulted cognition and instruments alike. Shadows moved independently, forming humanoid silhouettes that anticipated, mirrored, and diverged from our positions. Micro-cliffhangers erupted continuously. Doors opened into voids. Reflections twisted autonomously. Panels displayed readings, contradicting all known physical and temporal laws. The Warpstorm outside pulsed with the artifact, amplifying psychic, environmental, and temporal distortions. We advanced toward the central projection. Its liquid metal surface shimmered with sentient awareness, glyphs, and numerical motifs shifting dynamically across floors, walls, and ceilings. Spectral echoes of prior teams performed actions slightly ahead of our own, duplicating cognition and movement. Corey floated briefly as gravity shifted. A spectral duplicate mirrored him, anticipating behavior. I keyed observation clinically. The anomaly had evolved into a fully interactive, predictive, recursive system, integrating cognition, spatial distortion, and temporal manipulation simultaneously. Body horror intensified to an acute crescendo. Servitors fused with conduits twitched violently. Hydraulic pistons elongating into grotesque limbs and torsos of prior boarding teams protruded from walls, heads submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted to machinery. Halrick's chanting amplified harmonic resonance, projecting psychic trauma into environment and perception. Micro-cliffhangers multiplied, spectral echoes of crew repeated actions ahead of reality. Shadows moved semi-autonomously, reflections shifted unpredictably, producing relentless cognitive disorientation. The artifact pulsed violently. Glyphs formed interlaced geometric sequences across every surface, resonating at frequencies that produced both physical and psychic unease. Recursive feedback loops now encoded cognition, trauma, and perception into predictive sequences, affecting environment and crew. Simultaneously, shadows merged with spectral echoes, tracing anticipatory patterns, further manipulating perception. Predictive manipulation was undeniable. Every glance, step, and thought reshaped both physical and psychic reality. Micro cliffhangers, compounded, reflections acted independently, auditory hallucinations overlapped real sounds, and panels displayed impossible sequences, creating continuous tension. Macro cliffhanger erupted as Harwick duplicated multiple times, semi-autonomous projections, guided by artifact resonance. Bridge geometry folded upon itself, corridors looping impossibly, glyphs pulsed in sequences corresponding to cognition, movement, and prior crew positions. Eye-keyed observation, the anomaly had achieved full sentience, fully interactive, predictive, and recursive, controlling space, perception, and behavior simultaneously. Every crew action was anticipated, every sensory input manipulated. Side alcoves revealed prior boarding teams, fused with structural elements. Limbs protruded from walls, heads submerged in hydraulic fluid, sinews grafted to conduits. Glyphs traced sequences encoding spatial, behavioral, and cognitive data, reinforcing predictive manipulation. Micro cliffhangers persisted. Spectral forms acted independently. Shadows moved autonomously. Low-frequency vibration produced nausea and vertigo. Environmental readings contradicted sensory input. Recursive encoding of trauma projected continuous dread, rendering the anomaly omnipresent and inescapable. Floor panels warped beneath our feet, bending in impossible arcs. Glyphs traced dynamic routes, responding to steps, voice inflection, and gaze. Spectral projections duplicated prior crew actions, slightly ahead of perception. Eye-keyed observation, the anomaly functioned as fully interactive, sentient, predictive system, encoding cognition, trauma, and spatial patterns simultaneously. Haldrick moved in perfect synchrony, chanting amplifying harmonic resonance, reinforcing recursive feedback loops. Micro cliffhangers intensified, panels flickered, reflections duplicated independently. Shadows acted autonomously. Low-frequency vibration induced cognitive strain and vertigo. A final macro cliffhanger arose as the artifact pulsed with maximum intensity. The bridge folded in multiple impossible configurations. Harwick's chanting merged with spectral echoes, producing harmonic distortion that penetrated consciousness directly. Predictive sequences aligned perfectly with cognition, actions, and environmental variables. The anomaly's sentience was now undeniable. It controlled space, perception, and predictive behavior. Recursive feedback integrated environmental hazards, body horror, and psychic manipulation. Every crew motion was anticipated, every sensory input altered. Telemetry confirmed environmental readings, defied all instrumentation. Gravity, temperature, and air density fluctuated in direct contradiction to observation. Panels displayed sequences reflecting predictive cognitive manipulation. Shadows merged into semi-corporeal forms, interacting with spectral echoes, further distorting perception. Micro cliffhangers compounded, reflections acted independently. Spectral forms repeated actions ahead of reality, and environmental feedback loops amplified recursive horror. I keep the anomaly's full capacity, interactive, sentient, predictive, recursive, integrating space, perception, trauma, and cognition. The squad stood before the artifact, suspended between comprehension and irreversible horror. The Warpstorm outside amplified environmental, psychic, and body horror signals. Recursive, sentient, predictive anomalies had converged fully, integrating cognition, perception, and trauma. Harrick's chanting merged with spectral echoes. Bridge geometry folded impossibly. Artifact pulsed with awareness. Every reflection, spectral echo, and vibration signaled that the Erebus's whale had fully transformed into a conscious, warp-infused entity. The next step required irrevocable action. We deployed the final protocol, yet the cost was immediate. Kurz was fused into the artifact's predictive lattice. Spectral echoes of the squad now projected across corridors, and the anomaly's pulse intensified, as if feeding on our resolution. The aftermath revealed the true horror. The Warpstorm amplified the artifact's sentience beyond containment. Recursive manipulations remained active in the ship structure, integrating cognition, trauma, and predictive sequences into ongoing environmental distortion. Every reflection, every shadow, every spectral echo signaled unresolved anomaly. Our presence, partially absorbed into its lattice, ensured propagation of its consciousness. Telemetry failed entirely. Environmental feedback loops, now autonomous, the Erebus's whale had become both prison and predator, an entity whose influence would persist indefinitely, a sentient, warp-infused system now spreading beyond any single vessel. As I keyed the final observation, documenting what remained comprehensible, the bridge folded into impossible angles one last time. Gravity, air, and perception became irrelevant. Only harmonic resonance and predictive feedback loops endured. Henrik's voice, or what passed for it, echoed in spectral duplication, merging fully with the artifact's consciousness. Shadows and spectral echoes recurred infinitely, encoded into recursive lattice sequences that would survive the Warpstorm's dissipation. Our mission succeeded only in partial containment. The anomaly remained sentient, recursive, and expanding. Every reflection, vibration, and spectral echo ensured its presence. The final image lingered. A bridge twisted impossibly. Spectral echoes of crew, frozen mid-action. Harrick's form merged into pulsating glyphs, and the artifact's liquid metal surface throbbing, as if alive. The Warpstorm raged outside, an amplifier of consciousness, perception, and dread. Our survival was Pyrrhic. We left with knowledge, partial containment, and profound horror. But the Erebus's whale persisted, recursive, sentient, warp-infused. It would remain, encoding every sensory input, cognition and trauma, into ongoing projection. The final line I recorded: "We are present and yet, we are already part of it. The Warpstorm carries our echoes, and it is patient."